to start, sorry, it's been a while. I want to share two sets of acknowledgements. The first is our land acknowledgement. CSDE acknowledges we are located on Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations and other native peoples. This land acknowledgement is one small gesture and it's just an ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with Coast Salish lands, waters, peoples, and their other than human kin. CSDE's commission logo from Native artist UW Professor Marvin Oliver acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. Second, our funding acknowledgement. CSDE is extremely grateful for support from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, the School of Public Health and the School of Social Work, the Business School, the Population Health Initiative, the eScience Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research. So I'm really excited to introduce Zach Ward. So Zach Ward is an Associate Professor of Economics at Baylor University and a Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He received his PhD from the University of Colorado and worked at Australian National University until moving to Baylor. His research is in the fields of labor economics and economic history. Most of his work uses linked historical records to answer longstanding questions about the history of inequality in the United States, such as the rates of intergenerational mobility and the rates of immigrant economic assimilation. His current research topics include creating large data sets to measure multi-generational mobility for men and women since 1850, and understanding the importance of violence during the Mexican Revolution for Mexican migration in the United States. So normally we have questions after the talk, but Zach mentioned that he is an economist. So if you want to interrupt him at any point, feel free to do so. For those of you who are online, if you want to come in person, we're here. So just keep that in mind. And if you want to interrupt, just do it through the chat and I'll stop it. So
right. Yes, so thank you so much. Yes, please interrupt me if you have any questions or if anything is unclear. So this is relatively new work here, so it's prime for getting comments and feedback, so I'll be happy to hear what you think. But the title is Like Grandfather, Like Grandson, Multi-Generational Mobility in American History, co-authored with Casey Buckles at Notre Dame and Joe Price at BYU. So, we have this notion in the United States that all men are created equal, but this is a nice notion that we like to aspire towards, but of course we know that people are born into very unequal families, and this could have influences on people's long-run outcomes. So the way economists typically try to proxy for equality of opportunity is just through a simple descriptive regression where you take, say, the income of a child and you regress it on the income of a parent, and this is what we call intergenerational relative mobility. How strongly does parental income predict your child's income? If it's a very high beta 1, that suggests that parents' income really matters. I'm going to be doing matters in scare quotes here because it's really non-causal. This is just a descriptive regression. While if the beta 1 is relatively low, then your socioeconomic background doesn't matter as much. So there's a lot of famous estimates, across countries. So this is the quote unquote Great Gatsby's curve, which shows you on the vertical axis this exact estimate that I just told you about before. On the horizontal axis is a measure of cross-sectional inequality, or like a Gini coefficient. So the United States is in the upper right-hand side. The United States is relatively unequal. And then also these inequalities across people transmits across generations, right? So that's an estimate of about 0.5 within the United States. There's other estimates across commuting zones, across time that I've worked on. What we're going to be talking about today. Yes.
Could you provide us with a bit more intuition around that graph?
Yeah.
So on the y-axis, could you just I think most of us understand the x-axis, but the y-axis, if you could just.
Yes. Okay. So so a point estimate of about 0.5, which is where we are on the y-axis. The way we'd interpret that is if there's an income gap between two parents, about 50% of that income gap will still exist for the children. This is as opposed to say like Denmark, Finland, or Norway, where it's around 0.15 or 0.2, only like 20% of the gap transmits, which seems to suggest, in these Northern European countries, your background doesn't matter as much for the child outcomes.
Hey, I hate to interrupt, but we at home are only seeing like your PowerPoint app. We're not actually seeing the slide share.
Oh, can make this not presenter view.
It's like several of them, that's the problem. Maybe that one. Yes, you know?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Yeah, and also just FYI, when you walk away to
Oh, they-
point here, they can't see where you're pointing. So you have
yes.
to use your pointer on the screen.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, so United States is up here, Norway, these other people down here. You might say, maybe cross-sectional inequality is a problem. But maybe it's less of a problem if you think people are moving in and out of sort of the higher income groups. So, but the fact that this is a positive relationship suggests, there's an inequality, and then people are also sort of staying within the same part of the distribution. Yeah.
So we can do questions.
Yes.
Think about it. Is this graph, or in general when economists are doing this, are they controlling for race of this, or this is just straight?
Yeah. So this is an
top line
excellent.
effect?
Yes, this is an excellent question. This is going to be extremely important. There's no controls here, right? It's just literally measuring the relationship between the parent and child. There's a big difference between like trying to measure the causal effect of the parent, where you definitely would want to control for all this stuff. But what we're doing here is just literally trying to describe the relationship. So I sort of think of it as a Gini coefficient, like, you just start trying to measure the spread of the distribution, but this is sort of across generation. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is multi-generational ability. So basically, what happens if you have data on the grandparents? Okay, now there's sort of this theory within the economics world written by Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes, where they actually wrote down a theory of like what you would expect across multiple generations. And it essentially comes out to like, you can iterate the coefficients. And what I mean by that is, so if there's a 0.5 coefficient between parent and child, about 50% of the gap transmits one generation. We go to the next generation, then we can just do 0.5 times 0.5, and then just say 25% of the gap is going to transmit across multiple generations. And this is where you get this, there's an idiom, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, this idea, where your grandparents, the income of your grandparents basically doesn't really matter. Is sort of this idea. Now, there might be multi-generational drag from grandparents. So by multi-generational drag, what I mean is, instead of saying like, 50% one generation, 25%, 2 generations, it's actually more than 25%. Okay, so convergence across different income, across different families is much slower than you would expect. So in regression form, you'd regress the income on the parent and also the grandparent. And if so, we might be failing to capture long run mobility if there's these really strong influences. Now, yes.
So are you assuming that grandparents have a direct effect on the child, or is it an indirect?
We'll talk about that in a second. That's a great question. Okay, so modern day studies on the point coefficient for the grandparent are mixed, and what we're particularly interested in is it like statistically significant and positive or not. I'm going to be this talk is going to be a historical talk in terms of the United States between 1850 and 1940, because this is where we get some really good data on this stuff. Historical studies that have tried to come up with these samples where you can measure the grandparents overwhelmingly find that the grandparents quote unquote matter, which means that if you iterate these coefficients, the actual persistence between grandparent and grandchild is stronger than you would have expected. So just to give an example of this, one estimate from the literature suggests that if you have 3-generational data, persistence between grandparent and grandchild is 160% stronger than you would have predicted if you just iterated across 2 generations. So, if we go back to this 0.5 association, 0.5 times 0.5, you expect 0.25. What they find when you actually have data on the grandparents is basically 160% stronger or higher than that 0.25, which seems to suggest that there's very strong, quote unquote, multi-generational drag. And if it is so strong, then the proliferation of mobility estimates, which a lot of people have talked about within literature, will miss the long run trends. There's going to be a further puzzle here, that might suggest that there's a large direct effect from the grandparents on the grandchild. There's not that many great studies that sort of look at like exogenous variation in grandparental outcomes. There are a few. So within the historical literature, people have looked at the 1832 Georgia land lottery, which is essentially when Native Americans were forcibly removed from Georgia. They had a lottery for the land that was left over for people within Georgia, and you could look at people who randomly won the lottery versus randomly lost the lottery, and this is a very large wealth shock over like a year's worth of income, and they find essentially there's no relationship between winning this large amount of wealth and grandchild's outcomes. Similarly, people have looked at rich families in the South before the Civil War, and they looked at rich families that held their wealth in the form of enslaved individuals versus hold their wealth in form of some other type of mix for their portfolio. Civil War happened, emancipation, rich slaveholding families lost a lot of that wealth. You don't see large effects on their grandchildren in terms of if you've lost a lot of wealth during that time period. So it's a puzzle because this one estimate says there's a large drag. These other estimates say there's no direct effect essentially from grandparents and grandchildren. So there is this debate over multi-generational drag. Some say yes, there are these direct effects. Of course, grandparents. I'm able to travel to states outside of Texas because grandparents come and help take care of my children, right? So there is this time interaction with your grandparents. That can help form human capital. There's social networks that grandparents have, et cetera. This could lead to a positive grandparent effect. That depends on the context. Some people say, well, yes, there could be this relationship that exists due to indirect effects, like what we call group effects. And the easiest way to think about this is, in terms of the United States, is racial economic gaps. So basically, if the grandchild is Black and the grandfather's Black, there's going to be an association in their economic status, because you say, like you just said, if there's persistent discrimination across time, you'll see this association with the grandparent, but it has nothing to do with the grandparent actually interacting with the grandchild. Other people say, no, there's actually no relationship. There should be no grandparent effect. The real problem is that we're measuring the father's status with error. So the idea here is that we have limited data on the parent. We would ideally have like everything about their life. And in economics, what we're particularly interested in is this concept of permanent income. If we can get your income throughout your entire life and just have that number, that's what we want. We don't have that data. Usually you just have a snapshot of the parent, and that will measure permanent income with error for a variety of reasons. The grandparent will just simply provide more information about the parent. So we know what the grandparent does. It just tells you, okay, well, we know what the parent's doing. And the reason why the grandparent shows up to be statistically significant is because it's just providing more information about the parent. And if we had a perfect data set, the grandparent would actually not show up as being important. Third question, yeah.
Yeah, can you just clarify the extent to which you're thinking about wealth versus income?
Yeah, that's a very good point. What we're going to be doing today is actually primarily occupational-based measures of status. You could expect transmission across generations to be different for wealth versus for income or occupational-based measures of status. Yeah, right. So Bill Gates is donating a bunch of money here. You could think, though he signed some pledge about giving away all this money for his kids. But you can imagine if someone's very wealthy, they could directly transmit a bunch of wealth to their grandchild, and the grandchild will be wealthy because of the wealthy grandparent. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, so what are we going to be doing in this paper? I guess. Oh wait. So what are we going to be doing in this paper? Basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to build up a very large linked sample. We're trying to get basically the best sample possible of grandparents, parents, and children. Okay. This measurement error story is important, and we're going to try to account for measurement error using multiple observations of the father and the grandfather. So this is typically what's done within the economics literature. You know, if you think one snapshot, one observation of a parent is not good enough, just get another one. And we're going to try to get another one and try to use that information to try to capture their true socioeconomic status. A limitation of the literature so far is that it's actually only focused on the white population. So people have tried to measure multi-generational mobility historically. Does not include the Black population for a variety of reasons. Probably most importantly, a large share of the Black population is not enumerated in the data sources in 1850 and 1860. So they're not in the free population schedules of the census. So you can't really build up these data sets in the same way. We are going to try to include the Black population. We will eventually include females, but unfortunately not today. So I'm going to be talking about how we build up the data, but the way you build up historical data sets is essentially you're going to be searching through censuses for people that have the same names, age, and birthplace combinations. Daughters often change their surname in between childhood and adulthood, and because they change their surname, you cannot link them to the right person. Okay? If we had like social security numbers and stuff like that, we wouldn't have this problem. But we're dealing with 1850 to 1940 data, so that's going to be an issue. So we have females in the data, actually. We were able to get around this problem in a way that I'll talk about in a second. But what we're running into issues right now, which maybe some people have thoughts on, is how to measure socioeconomic attainment for women who do not report occupations. Because basically we have an occupational-based measure. Historically, a lot of women don't report occupations. So that's the issue that we're trying to figure out right now. So preliminary findings, so we're still putting this data together. Long-run mobility between grandparent and grandchild is much lower than previously estimated. Okay, this idea of measurement error and then using only the white population to measure mobility, this is going to overstate mobility for the population by nearly 100%. So the numbers that basically we're going to come up with is like if you just do it the way the literature has done, which looked at only the white population, ignored measurement error, you get about a 23% persistence between grandparent and grandchild. When we try to deal with some of these issues, you're getting more of like a 56% persistence between grandparent and grandchild. So much more strong persistence across generations. At the same time, multi-generational drag, the importance of the grandparent on top of the parent, becomes less important. Basically, as you account for measurement error, it's a story of like the grandparents providing more information about the parents. If we get better information about the parents, the grandparents not as important. Ultimately, we're going to have a small, positive, non-causal grandparent effect. So there is some evidence for multi-generational drag, but it's not going to be as strong.
Are you going to be accounting for differential fertility and mortality among those?
Yes. Okay. So the question was differential fertility and mortality. We're just going to pool everyone together. So if there's large families, small families, you're just showing up in the data set. We could sort of, I think some people sometimes measure mobility in sort of like downward weight large families, which we could do. When I've done that in other work, that doesn't really matter as much for intergenerational mobility. But I think like birth order effects, how many siblings, how many cousins you have. This is sort of getting more into sort of like a causal relationship. Like trying to understand why this effect exists, which we're sort of thinking as future work, because right now we're just trying to measure it correctly.
I was just thinking that maybe the grandparent effect would show up more positively in larger families because they could help out, like thinking back to that Rob Merritt.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. We need to, yeah, that's a great idea.
Can you repeat the idea?
Sitting up here.
Yes, so he was saying that basically the relationship between grandparent and grandchild could vary dependent upon the size of the family. And we should actually test that. So, yes.
I just had 2 points. So one, measuring it by occupation, could you also, because you were wondering about how to measure for women, could you also do it based on social class? I know that's kind of what some of the literature has done in the past within mobility. It's like either class, occupation, or wealth, right? Just if you could get the occupation data.
For historical data, at least that I've seen, the way people try to measure classes via occupation. So it's sort of still the same issue. The way we're sort of thinking of getting around it, which actually this is not in the slides at all, but in the census, everyone's enumerated along a line such that your next door neighbor is right next to you. And what you can do is basically look at neighborhood attainment and say, okay, if you're living in a high status with next to high status neighbors, you're likely to be high status. And that's basically what we're trying to do right now. It's just actually doing it, that's the fun part.
My second question was, you're interested in relative mobility here,
Yes.
correct? Not absolute.
Yes. So there is a difference. So there's many different ways of measuring mobility. The way economists typically measure it is either relative relationship between parent and child, grandparent and grandchild, or the slope coefficient of that regression. Absolute mobility is another way that economists measure it, which is like, do you literally earn more than your parent? We don't have data on earnings. What we're going to be much better at measuring basically where you are within the distribution, okay, between on like a 0 to 100 scale. So those absolute measures of gaining aren't as clear within our data, but ideally we would. Okay, what are we doing in this paper? We're just going to estimate a bunch of regressions and compare the coefficients is essentially what we're going to be doing. So we're going to build up a multi-generational data set. There's the relationship between the G1, the first generation, and the second generation. This is just a normal intergenerational regression, and we're going to save this A1 coefficient between the two. And then the same regression between grandsons and fathers, save that, and then have data where we estimate the relationship across grandfathers to grandsons. Have that, and basically we're going to say that there's multi-generational drag or grandparent effect if this direct coefficient between grandparent and grandchild is larger than the product of the two. So this is just exactly that story that I was mentioning before. If it's 0.5 for each of these, is the product of the two going to be greater than or less than 0.5? Okay, just checking on the time here. Accidentally unplugged this. Okay. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Good, we're back. Okay, so we're going to aim to test that. I talked about measurement error. We're going to think about two different types of error that could bias these coefficients. The two different types of error, at least for economists, are, we want permanent status, permanent income, sort of like your whole life cycle. But there's going to be transitory shocks. So basically, you have some health shock. You're earning less than what you would normally earn. You have some unemployment shock. You're earning less than or more, or you have some positive shock, right? You're earning differently than what you typically earn. And that might be the time that we see you. And then there's also going to be data error. So this is something that I've worked on before, but it turns out that historical census data contains significant error when you're recording occupation. And this is going to come from a variety of ways. It could be like your neighbor reports your occupation. So that could be just something like that. A lot of it's actually going to be just classifying people into different occupational groups. What I've shown in other work is there's, I looked at the 1880 St. Louis re-enumeration. So in 1880, St. Louis was enumerated twice because the first time the St. Louis residents got mad and thought they were undercounted. So what you can do is you can link these two enumerations together and compare the occupational reports during the same time period. And it turns out that only 2/3 of the occupational reports agree. So it's unclear why exactly this is happening. But you know, there's going to be error here. And then, you know, if we're calling you a certain occupation and you're not actually that occupation, we are mismeasuring your stats. So just to see how this affects our multi-generational estimates. So suppose, I like to think about this in terms of pictures. So suppose this is going to be gaps across family, like the first generation, second generation, there's only 50% of these gaps remain. Third generation, 0.25. And we're assuming that this is a true process where grandparents don't matter. So this is decaying at like the actual 0.25 times 0.25, 0.25. If you have measurement error, you're going to attenuate your coefficient on the parent. So basically, the relationship is weaker than what it should be because you don't have the right information about the parent. So you're going to mismeasure across the parent to child, and that's going to be your attenuation bias. A lot of times people just sort of take that coefficient and then iterate that out and predict that would be what would happen across multiple generations. And then they take the actual grandparents, grandchild data, and this is also just the same 0.7 attenuation bias. And then they say, oh, well, there's a gap between what we observe and what you would have predicted. So there's multi-generational drag. Grandparents matter, right? It's just measurement error. Now, representativeness matters. So going back to this idea of group effects, literature typically it just has the white population. It turns out that you know, this 0.47 association between parent and child is a weighted average of within race, so and across race correlations. So basically, it's a weighted average of the relationship, like for between white parents, white sons, black parents, black sons, and the gap, the average black-white gap, essentially. So the black-white gap has been very slow to converge, and this is just this is a paper by Baer and Charles in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And what we have right here is the black-white gap in terms of median earnings. And what you see is that basically the gap is pretty persistent and very slow to converge. And a very slow convergence means that this persistence between group is like near 1, 0% of this gap is converging. So essentially you're averaging in this very high persistence of the black-white gap with the within race association. So if we just try to show this graphically, if we have a within race parent-child association that's truly, there's no grandparent effect, but then you have a cross group association of, let's say, 0.9, this is like only 10% of the black-white gap closes after a generation. That's basically what this is assuming. The thing that you actually measure is a weighted average between the two when you take the whole population. So there was this question before about like this 0.47. Is it pulling everyone together? Yes, it's pulling everyone together. If you just did within race, you'd get this blue coefficient. Now, pooling will increase your grandparent-grandchild association. This is exactly what I'm going to show you later. When we add the black sample into the white sample, you're going to get much stronger associations across multiple generations. Interestingly, if you take this data and do an AR1 predicted iterated out, you could also get multi-generational drag just from group effects. Okay, so this is just another way of saying if you look at only a white sample, you might ignore these multi-generational drags. Okay, so I need to hurry up. So data creation. Basically, what we're doing is we're taking the first census, father observed with a child, link them later to another census, take that household, find a child within that household, link them to a later census. And this is the standard way it's done. Typically, you get like the occupation here, occupation for the grandson, occupation for the father, occupation for the grandfather, and you can estimate all this stuff. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be linking again to a second grandfather and then a second father observation in order to address this idea of measurement error. Now, I don't know how often people talk about historical linking in these contexts, but historical linking is difficult. You miss a lot of people. And we're linking, you miss a lot of people in just one link. We're linking 4 times. Okay, so this is like pushing to the limits in terms of linking a bunch of times. Now, since you lose a lot of people for a variety of reasons. Part is that the data is messy and people just sort of record names differently. Part of it is that people are just literally misreporting like their ages. And then the other part is the quote unquote John Smith problem, which is like if one person's John Smith, the other person's John Smith, you don't know which one's the right one. So you can't use them. Now, the counterfactual population, so what sample of grandparent, grandchild, grandson lineages do we observe within our data set? It's unclear because we don't exactly know, there's not like a single data set that records the population here, but we probably have about a 15% sample. Ultimately, we're gonna have 2.9 million lineages, and we're gonna weight this to be representative on grandchild observables. The way I think about this data set, you take a sample of people, you ask them what their father did, you ask them what their grandfather did. Also, I should know that this is paternal grandfathers. I can only look through 2 paternal grandfathers here. You tell them, and then the people who are taking the sample weighted based on observables to be representative. The difference here is that we can actually link back to the father and link back to the grandfather to get direct observations or multiple observations of the father and the grandfather. Okay, so we're going to use a different linking method than what's normally done. Typically, people use sort of these automated methods, like these algorithms where you look for someone in the next census, and then you you say, okay, does someone match on my exact name? No, let's widen the age range a little bit. Does someone match? No, and then they do it. We're going to do a different way, which is going to substantially increase our rates of linkages. We're going to use data from an online genealogical website called Family Search, okay, which identifies hundreds of millions of quote unquote true matches across census. So basically you can create, I encourage you to create a Family Search account if you don't have one. You can basically try to map out your family tree, and then you'll get into our data set. That's why I want you to do this. These are quote unquote true. We don't know if people are accurately doing this, but we're just assuming that they're accurate with their own family. And we're going to use this to inform of how to link, and then also to create a large scale training data for this. I don't know what just happened here, but I'll just verbally talk. One thing that you might not suspect about this Family Search data is that there's a lot of people in it. Okay.
I can see it.
Yeah,
We just
Yeah.
just give it some time to think. Okay, so you might think, okay, does anyone actually use Family Search? Some people. Okay, yes. So all it really takes is like one person who's like really dedicated to fill in a bunch of people. Like my aunt has filled in like 1,000 people in a family tree. There's actually a lot of people on these trees. This is just a tree of, can't really see it well, but of my co-author, where basically you have them, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, and so forth. So we actually have a lot of information about people. We're only going back 2 generations. There's 119 million links across 2 censuses just from this family tree, family search data. And this is how we're going to bring in women. So people can link women on their own. And if you compare it to sort of the traditional method that's used within the historical quantitative literature that you can download links from, it's called a census linking project. And add up all the links that you can do using these other like that's basically the state of the art at this point. There's actually more people within the family tree than there are in these other data sets. So you can think basically our training data that we're going to use machine learning models to predict out links for the entire census. Our training data is even bigger than what like the state of the art is at this point. And then when you predict it out, you actually get over 309 million links and 252 million links across these 2 different groups. So point being, we have a lot more people than what other people have done at this point. So this issue of how representative the sample is, like who survives quadruple linking, still a problem, less of concern when you're using our method versus other methods.
What's the population when you're going multi-generations?
Oh yeah, it's still just this, if you're 25, if the parent is 25 to 55 and the child is 0 to 4 and then black and white. Yeah. Okay, so let's actually get to the results. Okay, so we're gonna, what I'm trying to convince you is that measurement error matters. That's one of the things that I'm trying to convince you. So if we use multiple links, this is gonna matter. If you look at the association between grandparents and grandchild, just using one observation. So we're not doing multiple observations. It's like the standard way people have done it. You do between parent and child, predict those 2, multiply those 2, and then compare it to the actual data. There's a couple of results here. First off, the persistence of socioeconomic status, which is we're measuring basically as a 0 to 100 scale, primarily based on not only what occupation you are, but also race and where you live in the United States. About 28% of these gaps across grandparents persist to their grandchildren. It's just sort of a standard data set. That's 62% higher than you would have predicted if you iterated across data sets. So this is like a standard data set is showing you that there is quote unquote multi-generational drag. Grandparents seem to matter. Now we're going to say, well, what happens if we take the average of 2 father observations? So we can more precisely pinpoint their socioeconomic status because of errors when recording people. Now, if you just look at the grandparent to grandchild coefficient, it's 14% higher, which is telling you that, measurement error matters. I can't get this thing to point. Measurement error matters. If measurement error did not matter, that would not have changed. Like if one snapshot was perfect, that would not have changed. Now, what happens when you do it for both across multiply the grandparent, father, grandchild? Now the gap is only 39%. The reason why is basically you're that picture I showed before, but essentially attenuation bias exists 2 times for this A1 times B1, but only exists once for this gamma one. So there's less of a gap between the 2. Now, to actually fully correct for measurement error, it's difficult to do this without the full life cycle of occupations, essentially. And especially we have decennial census data. So like it'd be nice to observe every single occupation in between the censuses. What we're gonna do is we're gonna use just your standard way to fix measurement error, which is to instrument one observation with a second observation. And the assumption here is that error in one observation is uncorrelated with error in the second observation. For this to be accurate. Economists have sort of tried to understand this. And if you have a health shock, the question is, when do you get back to your normal income path? Usually it's about 2 to 3 years. So we're taking observations 10 years apart, which is less likely to be correlated in terms of errors. But yeah, so what do you get when you do this? 38% persistence between grandparent and grandchild, which is only 13% higher. So what is our point here? Account for measurement error, less of multi-generational drag, but the grandparent effect goes higher. Okay, so that's sort of one of our main results. I should have mentioned this up top. This is only for the white population. I'm going to add the black population in a second. If we actually do this regression that I told you in the beginning about this, where we have both the parents and the grandparent in the same one, as you account for measurement error, the grandparent's coefficient, which is this bottom one, goes down in magnitude, and then it goes up. The parent coefficient is going to go up in magnitude. Okay, now let's add Black families. So this is essentially averaging in this idea that the Black-white gap was strongly persistent over time. What you see here is that the grandparent-grandchild association is 52% stronger than you would have otherwise predicted. And this is where, I might have misquoted this up top, but the final coefficient is 0.58. Which is saying that about 58% of these gaps across grandparents transmits to the grandchildren. And that's as opposed to what we had over here, about 0.28 in our first column, if you will. If you did ignore all that stuff. Okay. Yes, so there's a bunch of different heterogeneity that you can do. One thing that at least Peter might be interested in is that you can do it by the foreign-born grandparents. There is this result within the literature that says the children of foreign-born parents are more upwardly mobile than the children of US-born parents. Particularly at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. So there seems to be this children of an immigrant advantage. What we can do is we can do the grandchildren of an immigrant advantage, and basically you find the same result where the grandchildren of relatively poor foreign-born people end up higher in the distribution than the grandchildren of of US-born grandparents. Another paper that I've sort of worked on is that argues that, like, if you look across different countries of origins, convergence of different country of origins in our context would be like Germany versus Ireland versus Italy, right? So the gaps across those groups are slow to converge, and you also see a sort of similar thing here. A big reason why we find strong persistence is because of the structure of the economy. So if you're trying to think, like, how does this apply to today? A lot of it has to do with farming. Okay, your grandparents a farmer, your dad's a farmer, you're a farmer. So farming is a particularly persistent occupation. If you look at non-farming occupations, there's much less persistence between grandparent and grandchild. But there is still a small amount of drag. And I kind of skipped over this, but we can do the trend of the grandparent-grandchild association over time, or the grandparent effect over time. And what we have in the beginning is that in the orange at the bottom, the grandparent effect is getting stronger and stronger over time. which suggests, if this trend actually continues, if you think about birth cohorts today, then maybe grandparent effects are large and important.
This is dropping the farmers.
I'm sorry, this is everyone. This is everyone. Yeah. Ideally we would have like the income tax data, like Raj Chetty and his group of economists have used like income tax data to measure intergenerational income mobility. Ideally, we would have also grandparents and could measure all this stuff. You can't really measure it as well in modern day data. Okay, so I'm going to conclude to leave some space for questions. Can we use 2-generational data to predict multi-generational associations? Somewhat there is this small positive grandparent effect. So there does seem to be this multi-generational drag that exists, but it's not as big of a deal as like we originally thought within the literature. It's not like we're completely missing the mark on long run mobility with our 2-generational data, as long as you're correcting for measurement error. We have evidence that drag has been increasing over time. On our to-do list at the bottom, we actually have a lot on our to-do list. Everything in here is measurement, primarily include women. So like all these numbers will change by the time the paper is actually published. So don't like take this to be gold, what are these numbers? There's always a question of like, what is the causal effect? And I bet maybe you have like questions of like, can we pin down what is the actual true causal effect of the grandparent on the grandchild? Can we look at grandparents who live with their grandchildren? Can we look like how geographically close they are? Can we look at like birth orders? Can we look at the size of the family? Can we look at all this stuff? And like we could, yes, we definitely could. One thing that we're sort of interested in looking at with this family search data is we also know when a lot of people died. And specifically, we know like if the grandparent died before the grandchild was born. So, that's like a real direct measure of interaction between grandparent and the grandchild. So we're going to incorporate that and see if these associations are different for people who died and not have died. But big picture, we're very excited about this project. We think we have really cool data. And we hope you think it is also interesting. So, yeah.
All right, so thanks a lot, Jack. So if you have questions and you're online, please enter it into the Q&A. If you have questions in person, you can just raise your hand. So are there any questions? So maybe just to get us going, maybe you could talk a little bit more about farmers. So you're saying that there's a lot of like persistence among the occupation, but there's a lot of like sons that move from the farm to the cities, and that causes a lot of mobility because just moving from the farm to the city.
Yeah.
That is big mobility. So could you talk more about?
Yeah, so we did I actually skipped over this because I was trying to be good on time, but like there is this interstate migration. So we can look at directly at geographical mobility, and you do see substantial gains in your socioeconomic status for those who move away from the grandparents. So exactly the story that you mentioned. And yeah, so that's a story for why you sort of see, I think, why you see sort of increasing mobility over time is this geographical mobility, basically urbanization. People are moving to the big city, and then you see that trend. Yeah, so farming is very important.
Yeah.
So just trying to think about how you're defining mobility by profession. It's by profession, correct? Like
Occupation.
Occupation.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a kind of continuum of like where a lawyer, a doctor will be considered this level,
Yes.
while within that continuum, so you're seeing that the grandparent effect is still significant, as in like if someone was a minimum wage worker in one period of time and their grandchild is still a minimum wage worker in the next period of time, but are you still adjusting for like how the occupations change across time?
Yes. So that's yes, I was being too quick in my presentation, but that's an excellent question. Basically, yes. So it's very difficult to measure sort of changing rankings of occupations between 1850 and 1940 when you want like sort of detailed occupation categories, which is what we want. And the way we're doing it is following work by Song et al., where essentially they look at literacy rates by occupation, and then that changes over time. And then you can change the ranking of occupations essentially over time. So that's how we deal with it. We've also used what economists like a lot more is like income data. And we've used that, and you find the same like results in the sense that measurement error matters, not including the Black population matters. So all that goes through. The numbers are just different. So like the actual 0.58 estimates between grandparent and grandchild, that is sensitive to how you measure, how you rank people essentially. That's why I sort of stress a little bit more sort of like measurement error matters, excluding the Black population matters, because the actual number is difficult to pinpoint with our rough measures that we have.
Curious about, this was a couple of slides back, the age ranges that you chose.
Yes.
Sort of what informed that if you're also thinking about mortality as well.
Yeah, so the age ranges are children who are between 0 and 14 within the household for parents who are 25 to 55. So there's sort of actually a debate in terms of for the younger ages. Some people like what you're concerned about is there's sort of a select group who stays within the household as you get older and older and older, right? So if you like, so we stopped at 14, but like some people include 15, 16, 17-year-olds, which they would leave the household back then. And then parents, we've actually widened the age range to be larger than that, and it's not a big deal. You asked about mortality, right? Is that what you asked? Okay. So we do link people, we try to find them basically in every single census possible. So it's like 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later for the children. And then for the parents, 10 or 20 years apart. And if we don't get you, you're not in the data. You know, to a certain extent, I guess, yeah, so these mobility estimates, like they're sort of, we need to think a little bit more, you know, are we missing people? Are we somehow biasing these estimates because we're missing people who died earlier? And, you know, there's also sort of a question, there's some major wars that happened throughout this period, right? You know, did a select group of individuals die during these wars? And, you know, that would influence our statistics. Definitely. I don't think of it as like sort of a bias though, the war question, in the sense that like we are truly measuring who like lived through these wars. But it's so like the number can change across birth cohorts because a war happens. And that's an interesting question. But in general, if we're not capturing certain people, that's still something we should think more about.
Kind of expand on that selection bias question. I know you said your estimates are probably better than other methods, but just in terms of like, who is this who we're seeing who shows up in subsequent censuses? What are we missing about like people who are internationally migrating or people who just can't be linked, or like what else?
Yeah. So it's a very important question. The way we try to handle this. So like we're missing people who have very common names. We're missing people who leave the United States. We're missing people who die before the next census. We're missing, so the census is under enumerated as well. Like the census just wasn't successful at getting 100% of the people all the time. We're missing those people. Now, that is, we should probably think a little bit more like if we should put bounds on these in the sense of make some assumptions about who we're missing. What we do to try to address this is we weight the data to be representative based on the grandchild's observation. So kind of similar what I was saying before in the sense that like you take a sample of individuals you look at their characteristics. Are the characteristics of the people that are in your sample very different from the population? If they are, we'll weight the data to match the population. That could still not completely address all those issues though. But honestly, the weighting only really matters. We've sort of looked at like the difference in weighted versus non-weighted estimates. The weighting only really matters for the racial composition of the sample. So I didn't mention this, but it's much more difficult to link Black individuals than it is to link white individuals for a variety of reasons. And if you don't weight the sample, your sample is as a very small fraction Black. And we basically need to upward weight the Black population. But if you look within race, weighting doesn't really matter that much.
Really fascinating talk, thank you. I don't have a question, I have as I think about all the additional forms of heterogeneity to add and put more on your to-do list. Geography seems fascinating to me here, and I know you mentioned imaging, like mobility kind of as a general, but I'm just like wondering if different regions of the country would see very different things. I think we all, there's sort of the stereotype of the West as the land of opportunity during this phase and so on. So so maybe not just any migration, but do different. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So this is sort of like. I'm sorry. This is not my result. I should say. Then I lost it because I bumped this thing again. So the yes. So this is something that people care a lot about with the modern day literature. We basically want to know if you can essentially percentile rank. Basically, there's places of opportunity and places of non-opportunity. And what we want to know is that are we describing the wrong places if we can include information about the grandparents. So basically, what's on the to-do list is basically to estimate something like this. This is by commuting zone. This is from Raj Chetty and co-authors for modern day data by commuting zone. What we want to do is basically do the same thing historically and then see if the rankings differ once you include information about the grandparents. Where are the places of opportunity even better when you include information about the grandparents, or even worse when you include the grandparents? But that is on the to-do list, and it's a great.
I've had a somewhat similar thought but it was around your graph around the growing. I think it was the growing impact of grandparents later. Cohorts for later cohorts. And I was thinking about patterns of stability or ways in which migration and family settlement and all of that was sort of solidifying, and that could help. But again, it's like what Steve said, it's just another way in which to think about this heterogeneity across space and across time in the relationship between. So, which also relates to Peter's point around possibly smaller families. I'm not sure. I should know my historical fertility data, but
no, I think that's a good. I feel like there's a lot in this data that we need to explore. And you could sort of say, like, you look at geographically mobile families and see the trend over time, and look at non-geographically mobile families and the trend over time. And if those are very different from this picture, then that would suggest that geographic mobility matters. So I think that is on. I'll add it to the yes.
By the way, great organization. I was watching online and it was very easy to follow. Thank you so much. It's underappreciated. I want to ask about the linking process.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether there's like a known quote unquote grantor data for linking, but do you have any form of accuracy metric that shows like how confident your
I think I deleted it from this. It's like I was trying. This is normally an hour and a half presentation. I turned it into an hour and I deleted that slide. So there are these measures you can use, and there's sort of like a precision measure out of how many links you have, how many are quote unquote true links. And for the data that we are using within this paper, it's about 98%. precision rate. Which is pretty similar to what other people using these automated linking strategies. The big gap between our method and other methods is not so much about like the precision of it, it's more that we're just able to get a lot more. But yeah.
But it's kind of amazing that with less conservativeness, you still get a similar precision, but a lot more links.
Yes. So, of course you could get like a very high number of observations just by randomly linking people, and then you just be completely wrong, right? But there is a trade-off, I should say, there is a trade-off between, I always compare to what are called conservative methods that other people use, because those are more precise. I think there's sort of a movement towards away from using less conservative methods because of this lack of precision that you're talking about. So in my mind, I'm comparing to like the most precise of what other people use.
All right, so thank you very much, Zach. Join us not next week because it's a holiday, but in 2 weeks we have a panel on featuring our regional affiliates. So thanks a lot.
Okay.